Good. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Delilah Rothenberg. I'm from the Pre-Distribution Initiative, and I am pleased to welcome you to the World Benchmarking Alliance Financial System Benchmark Methodology launch. We're going to go over a few housekeeping items and then jump right into the program. So as you may have noticed, that this program is being recorded. We will be sharing the recording along with the full methodology and next steps on the data collection process throughout 2022 following the event. So you should receive that over email. We do encourage you all to share your thoughts and perspectives related to the conversation on social media using the hashtag FST benchmark. So that's F is in financial system, S transformation, T benchmark, and tagging at SDG benchmarks. We would like to make this as interactive as possible, so please feel free to use the chat function to share your thoughts, ask questions, share resources, and hopefully we'll have time for Q&A during the panel discussion. As quick background, I'm really pleased to be moderating today. The Pre-Distribution Initiative focuses on ESG issues at the investor level. So we're thinking a lot about asset owners and allocators, pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, endowments, foundations, and a lot of these entities often get overlooked in ESG and impact investing frameworks when we think about making the economy more sustainable, because a lot of our ESG and impact investing frameworks, our metric systems are very focused on the portfolio companies of these entities, and banks are covered because they're portfolio companies, and to a certain extent the operations of insurance companies are covered, but lots of times we're not focusing on the actual investment function itself. And so I was thrilled when the World Benchmarking Alliance decided that they were going to pursue this track, and we worked closely with Emily Goodall when she started the program, and we're really pleased to be working with Alicia Kido as well. So with that, I am actually to hand it over. First, we are going to see a brief video message from Hendrik Dutoit, the CEO of 91, and then a few remarks from Steve Waygood, who's joining us from Aviva, and you might know that he's the Chief Responsible Investment Officer of Aviva Investors. So I will, I believe Pratik will put up the video now. Thanks. Can everybody hear?
Pratik, there is no sound.
Thanks for bearing with us while we work through this minor technical issue. I'm sure we'll get on track shortly.
Sorry, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Delilah,
Yes.
I think there's a technical issue with the video, so maybe we can turn it over to Steve.
Okay, that sounds good. So Steve, welcome.
Hi, Delilah. It's lovely to be here. I was so looking forward to what Hendrik Dutoit was about to say. So I'm sorry, I'm sure everyone is, that we've missed that for now. I hope we can come back to it. If not, I imagine we can email the actual video to the people who are on the line, and then they can kind of watch it at their leisure. But I've worked with Hendrik for a long time, and I'm very proud to be one of the ambassadors for the World Benchmarking Alliance, as is he, I believe. And we've seen it come a long way over a really short period of time. I remember being at the launch of WBA in 2018 at the UN General Assembly and worked with a number of the people, including Pratik, actually, in advance of that to try and get it into the position where it could be launched. So it's come a long way in a relatively short period of time, and the potential is huge. Now, we originally thought that it was necessary for civil society to be able to see how the keystone corporate actors were performing in relation to delivering the SDGs. And as one of the world's largest investment institutions and a systemically important financial institution, I'm speaking as Aviva, I think it is only fair that financial institutions are also ranked in relation to how we behave. It's sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander, if you want to think of it like that, or walk the talk, if you want to think of it like that too. It's only right. It's also worth pointing out, and the WBA methodology does this really well already, that it's incredibly complicated, finance, and it's incredibly poorly understood. I honestly think there's no one in the world that understands the whole thing. It's that big. It's like trying to imagine infinity and keeping it in your head. So the whole of the banking system is incredibly complicated, as is insurance, as is investment. And then if you go through all the asset classes and then all the subsectors and try and understand everything that you need to do to deliver the SDGs, that's many, many PhDs across time and space. It's very, very complicated. So having something that brings it together, like the World Benchmarking Alliance does, is extremely welcome. So I've been a banking analyst. I work in an insurance business, and I oversee an investment business, if you like, as the Chief Responsible Investment Officer at Aviva Investors. And what I loved about the methodology that WBA offered most was the way it focuses on system change. It takes a very holistic perspective, recognizes that the markets are not currently aligned with the delivery of the SDGs. And in fact, that's why they exist. If the markets were aligned, the goals would not be a problem. The markets would be delivering them properly. The fact is that in every case, there are market failures and there are externalities where we need to align the underlying market so the profit motive is harnessed to deliver the actual SDG that is being sought. That requires government intervention. Now, that isn't me as a finance professional seeking to abrogate responsibility onto governments for delivering a restructured economy and a market that harnesses the profit motive to deliver the SDGs. Because I think our role, as is actually highlighted in the methodology, our role in shaping government policy is really important. Collectively, financial institutions have real agency when it comes to speaking to financial regulators, when it comes to speaking to our end clients, the citizens of the world. We have 33 million customers as Aviva. How are we encouraging them to behave? And also, particularly in the context of the conversations that we have with government ministers and policymakers. So many, many financial institutions were at COP26 in Glasgow. I've been going to COPs since COP5 in Bonn in the late 90s, and there was hardly anyone else there from finance at all at that point. Now I was tripping over them every few minutes. So it's a game that has absolutely changed, and we're starting to see the massive focus globally on ESG. People are beginning to realize that that is A, very, very commercial. It's totally disrupted the market. And B, it only takes us so far in the context of the SDGs. It only takes us to the point where companies are, if you like, doing the right thing as far as it pays them to do. It's exploiting and closing market inefficiencies. It doesn't correct market failures. ESG integration, ESG engagement by itself doesn't tell companies to leave money on the table where it pays them, for example, to dig it out of the ground and burn it. That is why we need to actually engage with the system so that it harnesses the profit motive. So the very careful points in the methodology here about, first of all, a consultation that was built over 2 years with finance to try and understand it. Secondly, the careful presentation of the results in due course about to enable stakeholders to make meaningful interpretations. And then thirdly, a recognition that this is a massively complicated area that's rapidly evolving. And then finally, I think the area of macro stewardship is the one that my industry delivers least well. We're all proud of how good a steward we are or seek to be in relation to corporate equities and how we vote at their AGMs. But what about what we say to governments when we lend them trillions of dollars in debt, in their sovereign debt portfolios? I think that is an industry frontier that hopefully the WBA can seek to push further forwards faster. Because as a theory of change, I think it's only when you have all the large financial institutions talking to governments about how worried they are about the long-term macroeconomic consequences of unsustainable development that you make this meaningful over the political cycle. That's why this benchmark matters so much. It's a game changer. Thank you. Back to you, Delilah, and perhaps back to Hendrik if the audio is working.
Thanks, Steve. Well said. And Pratik, do we have perhaps the video at this point?
We do not, unfortunately, but we will send it out and follow up to this session.
Okay, that sounds good. So, Ellie, we look forward to hearing from you now about a roadmap for transformation and the methodology presentation.
Thank you very much, Delilah. Thank you, Steve. I will be repeating some of the things you said and you laid out so eloquently about WBA and about the methodology. Pratik, do you think we can have the presentation up? Thank you. Great. So if we can, before I start on the methodology, let me share a few words about WBA for those of you who do know us. The World Benchmarking Alliance is a non-profit organization. We started over 3 years ago. Our aim is to incentivize the private sector in contributing towards sustainable development and delivering a sustainable future for all. This is based on a firm conviction that we can not only rely on governments or civil society organizations to bring about change. The private sector has a crucial role to play in advancing sustainability and the SDGs, and we use those as a guide. So the way we try to incentivize the private sector is by benchmarking, and that is creating rankings and analysis based on impactful methodologies. Our benchmarks are informed by best available science, and they build on existing norms, standards, frameworks, and initiatives. They are free for everyone to use and are continually improved through open and inclusive multi-stakeholder dialogue. The way they work is by highlighting the laggards and the top performance within each industry and within each system. They can be used by investors to encourage or discourage corporate performance. They can be used by governments and regulators to make informed decisions about policy. And they can serve as roadmaps to companies themselves. And in all these ways, they act as an accountability mechanism for private sector actions and behaviors. And finally, we are not alone in this. We have an alliance of more than 280 organizations that come from the public sector, from industry, from business, from financial institutions and civil society, and we develop these transformative benchmarks with them. Next slide, please. At the moment, we are facing multiple sustainability crises. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, it was estimated that we would not reach all of the SDGs until 2082. The pandemic and the associated economic crisis are likely to put progress back yet another decade. By 2030, the number of people living in extreme poverty could increase to over 1 billion. And as we heard in COP, we are already deviating from the 2 degrees Celsius trajectory, risking crossing a number of Earth's tipping points. So we need urgent action, which can be achieved through transformative change. The way we look for this action is through 7 systems. These correspond to the Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement. And these 7 systems are food and agriculture, digital inclusion, climate and energy, nature, urban, social, which underpins all other systems, and the financial system, which enables all other systems. And our aim is to benchmark 2,000 of the most influential companies by 2023. So why a financial system transformation? First, because of the central role that the financial system has in our economies. As many of you know already, working in the financial sector, the financial system serves as a facilitator and intermediary for encouraging, mobilizing and allocating funds towards their most productive use. It plays a critical role in diversifying and mitigating risk. It promotes economic growth, it drives investment, and of course, the financial industry employs millions of people worldwide. However, the same financial system has enabled economic activity to carry on unchecked and has contributed to huge environmental and social challenges that we are facing today. We are deviating from our aim to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, putting the more ambitious target to 1.5 even further out of reach. We are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction in terms of biodiversity, on which half of the global economy depends. And on the social front, inequality is on the rise. The world's richest 1% has more than twice as much wealth as 6.9 billion people. So these transitions pose huge risks to people and planet, as well as the economic system, and in turn, risks to financial institutions themselves. So our vision for the financial system transformation is one in which financial institutions not only address their negative impacts, intended and unintended, but also serve the societies and ecosystems in which they operate. They offer solutions and deliver positive impact. This goes beyond making net zero commitments to reorienting capital towards a restorative, regenerative, and equitable economy. It is our firm belief that the financial system should serve people and planet and not the other way around. So, as part of our benchmarking process, we identified the 400 most influential financial institutions to assess them on their readiness to address these global sustainability transitions and their contribution to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement. The 400 keystone financial institutions include asset owners, asset managers, banks, and insurers. And this system-level approach, which Steve also mentioned earlier, is key to driving the transformation of the financial system. We felt that the key transitions ahead and the urgency to address these transitions require a holistic approach. So, although we recognize that these distinct industries perform different functions in the market, they are highly interconnected. The first shared characteristic is that they are all intermediaries of one form or another, managing assets and liabilities. And the second is that in this capacity, they all impact people and planet directly through their own operations, but more significantly, indirectly through their business activities, their financing activities, whether these are investing, lending, underwriting, and through their political engagement. So our methodology focuses on the characteristics that are common across these industries. So how did we develop this methodology? As we heard earlier, this process has been going on for almost 2 years now. And when we first started thinking about a financial transformation, it seemed like an impossible task. It is a very complicated system, and it was very challenging to think about how could we transform the financial system without talking about changing capitalism, and how could we reach out and engage with financial institutions to change their practices without sending a signal that we are questioning the way they do business. So then we started talking to stakeholders, civil society organizations, policymakers, legislators, and representatives from the financial institutions themselves. We talked to sustainable finance experts, and we did extensive desktop research. We published our first findings, which was the financial system scoping report in January 2021. And we used this as a starting point to have further conversations and understand what society would expect from financial institutions that operate sustainably. The whole aim has always been to identify the actions and behaviors that financial institutions that respect defined physical limits of our planet and the less defined normative limits of our societies have. So we came across a number of technical issues like carbon pricing, financed emissions, nature positive solutions, offsets. We looked at the numerous ESG products and disclosures that often seem very ambitious, but may in fact have limited impact on the real economy. We experimented with proposing a first set of issues as a roadmap. This was our draft methodology, which was published in June 2021 and included many issues which were not ambitious enough and many issues that were too ambitious and too advanced for where the industry is now. So we held more conversations with our extensive network of allies, internal and external deliberations, and we identified the 32 key issues that I will present today. We felt that these are essential if the financial institutions are to deliver on what society expects, on the sustainable development goals, and on whether institutions are part of the problem, are not part of the problem, but are part of the solution. So these 32 issues comprise the methodology for the financial system transformation, and these are the ones which we will evaluate, assess, and rank 400 of the most globally influential institutions in 2022. Where we could, we aligned with existing frameworks and initiatives, conscious of the regulatory changes which are underway, but we also added issues which we heard and felt that were essential in pivoting the current approach of financial institutions from a perspective of how sustainability affects them to an approach that looks at the impact that financial institutions have on the economy, the society, and the environment. So the methodology development was overseen by an ERC, an expert review committee, of which Corinne is here today. They were independent experts from different backgrounds and different geographies. We met twice with them throughout this process, and we had several bilateral conversations, and we owe them a big thank you, as we would have never done this without them. Looking forward, in the months leading up to the benchmark publication in the fourth quarter of 2022, the ERC will review the scoring guidelines and the benchmark findings. So over now to the actual methodology itself. The methodology consists of 32 issues that are divided across 3 measurement areas. The first is governance and strategy, at the center, representing 40% of the total score. The second is respecting planetary boundaries, which represents 30% of the score and includes 2 sub-themes: Paris alignment and nature and biodiversity. And the third is adhering to societal conventions, again, counting for 30% of the total score and including issues on human rights, providing decent work, and acting ethically. In greater detail, under our first measurement areas, we have 5 indicators. The first one focuses on whether the financial institution has impact management objectives and targets embedded in its strategy and business model. Our second indicator focuses on senior leadership accountability and remuneration. Here, we look at whether the financial institution assigns decision-making and oversight responsibility for a strategy on impact or sustainability themes to the highest governing body. We also look at whether board members have specific objectives and targets relating to sustainability themes, society and the environment, and remuneration aligned with meeting these targets. Under gender equality, We look at whether the financial institution promotes women at the top and in senior leadership positions, and whether it discloses the gender pay gap. Under our fourth indicator, engagement policy, we ask of the financial institution to have a clear engagement policy on sustainability and impact topics and be a responsible steward of assets. Finally, we look at whether the financial institution has a consistent policy approach in its lobbying and public policy engagement. In the second measurement area, we have two themes. The first one is the alignment to 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory. Under this theme, we look for disclosures that show the financed greenhouse emissions of the financial institutions. Then we will examine whether the financial institution sets science targets and whether its engagement with the companies it provides financial services to is in line with the 1.5 trajectory. Under our indicator number 9, climate solutions, we look for evidence of financing climate solutions and the definition that the financial institutions provide on them. Finally, under our indicator number 10, we examine whether the financial institution has phased out or has a plan to phase out the provision of any type of financial service to any new fossil fuel projects or companies across the fossil fuel value chain. And this is in line with the latest scenario of the International Energy Agency. The second theme of this measurement area focuses on nature and biodiversity, and here we follow a similar logic. We ask that the financial institutions acknowledge their impact on biodiversity and nature and attempt to minimize harm while offering solutions. We examine whether they have set targets, which we are realizing that they're developing at the moment in terms of metrics, and how they are translating these targets into their financing activities and their engagement. Finally, we also ask them to share any information about nature and biodiversity related solutions. Finally, in the third measurement area, adhering to societal conventions, we include a set of indicators that are based on responsible business conduct and represent a set of fundamentals in terms of corporate behavior. For instance, here, we include a set of indicators on human rights. These follow the human rights due diligence process, which is about identifying human rights impacts, assessing them, and integrating them in decision-making. We would like to see financial institutions undertake this process across all their financing activities. And here, we are also examining disclosures on grievance mechanisms for employees, as well as external individuals and communities. Also included in the same measurement area, in the next slide, please, we are looking for commitments on living wage, working hours, health and safety, and collective bargaining. And we also examine how financial institutions protect personal data, what is their tax policy and whether it is global and approved by the board, whether they publish information per jurisdiction. We will also look for disclosures that prohibit bribery and corruption and providing political contributions. Finally, we will ask for information on financing usually excluded groups, such as women-owned businesses, lower-income developing countries, and small and medium enterprises. So we realize that this may represent a departure in the way financial institutions currently approach sustainability. In some jurisdictions, like the United States, these issues are very political. But change is already happening too fast. Nobody could have predicted what would happen and whether we would be having this conversation 2 years ago. Over the past year alone, we have witnessed an explosion in policy developments related to corporate sustainability. particularly in terms of disclosure standards and reporting regulations. And these developments have in part been motivated by scientific consensus and shifting societal expectations. On the biodiversity space, it seems that the industry is even moving faster than the regulators. So our work is in addition to this changing landscape. As regulation raises the floor, we raise the ambition and shed light on the key issues that need to be addressed to transform the financial system so that in turn it can finance the multiple economic and social transitions ahead. So for those financial institutions that are on the call and are in scope today, I would like to ask them to actively engage with us throughout the data collection process. And please reach out in order to discuss the methodology. To those organizations that are on the line and have direct contact with financial institutions in scope of the benchmark, who may not have joined or are not familiar, please put us in touch with those organizations so that we can start engaging with them. Financial institutions that are here but are not in scope, please use this methodology as a roadmap to inform your own actions. And finally, for all the other stakeholders, please reach out to us about joining our alliance and joining the movement that we're creating, so that we can collectively use our expertise, networks, and influence to drive behavior change by financial institutions. Please join us in having these conversations. Please join us in transforming the financial system. We think that we can do better together. Thanks, Delilah. Over to you.
Thank you, Ellie. That was really informative and a great foundation for the rest of our conversation. I would now like to ask Karine Ab, who's the lead for positive impact finance at UNFFI, and you just saw that she was also on the expert review committee for the methodology, to share some remarks on building on best practice. Karine, over to you.
Thank you, Delilah. Thank you, Ellie, for the overview, and delighted to join everybody here today for the launch of the benchmark methodology. So just a bit of background. So I'm with the UNEP Finance Initiative. That's shorthand for United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative. For those of you who may not be familiar with UNFFI, we're a partnership between the United Nations and a global network of 400 mainstream financial institutions, spanning the banking, insurance, and investment themes within the finance sector. And so I think very excited to have been part of indeed the expert review council as this methodology was being put together. UNFFI really the journey on impact dates back quite a while. UNFFI initiated its work 30 years ago now, but actually started its dedicated work on impact and the SDGs in 2017. And what really has been the centerpiece of our action has been to see how can we drive an impact logic in mainstream finance. So beyond something that will be for very bespoke and specific projects or entities, and really how we bring that to the core of the financial system and of the real economy. And really the center of our whole approach, of our whole theory of change, as the expression goes, has been the notion that we need a holistic approach that considers positive and negative impact across all the different aspects of sustainability. And so I believe the World Benchmarking Alliance logo with the different colors is reflective of the SDGs in many ways, and the fact that we do need to look at the environmental, the social, and the developmental pillars at once. And so I'm asked to respond to the methodology that is presented today. after these months of work on the methodology. I think there are really 5 things that stand out from Unify's perspective, and which we also see as an interesting further continuation or building on some of the thinking that is currently in this broader sustainable finance landscape. So very much something that we feel builds on some of the work Unify has pursued, but also, and just as a final point of context, as something that reflects community of norm building and convergence is emerging in this space with, for instance, the impact management platform that was announced just a month ago now, and of which both Unify and WA are part, where we're really trying to put together a coherent and complete system of norms and resources for impact management in mainstream business finance. So we're saying 5 points. And so briefly, I think the first is really the fact that the benchmark does consider the financial system. So to the point that was made very much at the beginning already, this was pointed out, where we're not homing in on just one segment or one particular audience within the finance system, whether it's investors, banks, or insurers, but really looking across the whole. And this is really quite fundamental and new, I think, in terms of the benchmarks currently available. I will not belabor the point that these are deeply interconnected, and that one cannot hope to address the financial system without looking at all those components. The second point is, I guess, again reflective of a systemic approach, which is the attempt really with this methodology to look at sustainability, to look at the SDGs from an end impact perspective, i.e., what are the impacts, the effects that financial institutions and the financial system as a whole has basically on environment, on people, and on economic development, which is of course something that is intrinsically linked to how those same factors have an impact on financial institutions and their clients or their investee companies, but does take a broader perspective. So this is something that is also very key positioning in our view, and again something that takes us perhaps a little bit beyond what we current benchmarks. Other points that we very attached to in this methodology is actually the very first indicator that Ellie described, talking of strategy and management. At Unify, all of our work, as mentioned, is about how we take impact and understanding impact in mainstream business and finance. And ultimately, this boils down to how these factors are included into the strategy and how it's understood that they intermesh with the business model. There is no human activity, there is no business, there is no financial institution that does not have impacts of some sort. And that will always be a mix of positive and negative impacts. So really having an understanding and having the ability to identify those impacts and to analyze them is really the first step if one hopes to manage the impacts and to manage them in a way that will be coherent with the business model. And so that is really a very central factor, and glad to see that this is given very, very high priority in the methodology. Last 2 points, and I will perhaps then leave it at that. It's been, of course, also very important for us to see how the environmental and the social components of the methodology have been given equal weighting. I think it sends an important message at a time where a lot is said about the need to do more on social, but where we tend often to still have quite a high focus or priority on environmental issues. And so I think this is a strong positioning that needs further encouraged. Finally, a very important aspect is, I think, in this methodology, is the reference to engagement in quite a broad sense. Financial institutions, as is rightfully pointed out in the document, are an enabler, a little bit like the oil in the machine. The actions themselves come from players, the real economy as such. However, what is absolutely fundamental in what financial institutions can do, and where some of them in particular have very close and even contractual relationships with the real economy, there's a real possibility to engage and even to actually share, as it were, certain targets, certain objectives, because ultimately the financial sector can only deliver on sustainability in as far as its clients and its investee companies deliver. And so that engagement is going to be absolutely fundamental to success. Also an interesting avenue, I think, for further exploration in methodology. There are a number of things, obviously, that will require adjustment over time. I think it's also very encouraging to see that that is already envisaged, that's integral to the approach of the benchmark, to reiterate and to adjust and to continue to build up methodology over time. And so that is, also, I think, a very lucid approach.
Irene, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
I was going to stop.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for those great remarks, and we look forward to coming back to them in the interactive panel. I'd now like to introduce Satoshi Ikeda, who's the Chief Sustainable Finance Officer for Japan FSA. Thank you, Satoshi.
Thank you, Dilala, and thank you for having me today. It's an honor to speak at this launch event. Well, by way of introduction, I come from the regulator circle. I'm the Financial Services Agency of Japan, which is the regulator of the capital market and the supervisors of the banks and the insurance companies and other financial entities. And as a Chief Sustainable Finance Officer there, I'm tasked with promoting sustainable finance. And in this capacity, I have had a privilege to work with the World Benchmarking Alliance since Japan hosted the G20 meetings in 2019, and particularly towards the development of the financial system benchmark methodology. And with this in mind, my congratulations go to all those involved in the creation of the methodology. Well, the financial system is an integral part of a socio-economic system, and with sustainable development goals in place, our societies have decided to take steps towards enhancing sustainability in well-being, equality, social justice, nature, and climate, and economic development. So the financial system as an important infrastructure that supports the socio-economic system must be aligned with this movement. At minimum, the financial system should not hinder the progress, or more desirably, the financial system should lead the progress towards enhanced sustainability. Well, as in the case in many new developments, there will be innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards among financial entities, even in this endeavor. So in moving ahead with this sustainability agenda, it is critical to know which is which among financial entities. And furthermore, these involve not only business corporations and financial entities, but also consumers and civil society. And the accumulation of these actors' actions will result in visible transformation of its ecosystem. So in this sense, transparency around such assessment of individual financial entities, as well as assessment of the overall financial sector, will also be necessary. So for any financial authorities, including Japan FSA, who seek to align the national financial system with the sustainable development goals, the objective, consistent, and comparable metric for such assessment has been something always in the wish list. And if the financial system benchmarks becomes readily available, it will certainly be one of the wish comes true things for them. And true, there are already a number of other competing attempts on offer in the market, but a new addition to the list of available sustainability metrics will certainly expand the scope of our policy choices. And today marks the end of the development phase for the financial system benchmark. But this is also the beginning of the new phase for producing actual scores and rankings for the 400 most influential financial institutions in the globe. I think new phase will be highly constructive and successful in data collection and engagement with covered financial entities, and commend all the tireless efforts dedicated by the World Benchmarking Alliance going forward. With these efforts, the financial sector benchmark will be a uniquely attractive option for financial authorities committed to enhancing sustainability in the financial system. That's my observation. Thank you.
Thank you, Satoshi. And looking forward to coming back also in the discussion. As the audience can see, we have a wide range of different representatives from different stakeholder groups joining us. It's great to hear different ways that they are planning on interacting with the benchmark and different ways that they've contributed as well. So now I'd like to introduce Matt Orzak, who's a Senior Director of Capital Markets Policy at the CFA Institute, to discuss realigning incentives. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Delilah. Thanks for everybody for having me here today at the WBA launch events. I think the work you guys are doing is critical of importance. Getting to aligning incentives. You know, we as people, we're not as complicated as we like to think we are. We're very simple creatures when you get down to it. We do what we're incentivized to do. And whether it's our industry, financial professionals, or the issuers we look at, or policymakers, we're going to be addressing issues like climate or natural capital or the SDGs. The incentives that are intertwined in that system are one of the things we need to get at. And whether it's our industry of financial professionals thinking more long-term about our incentive structures, or the issuers we talk to, aligning their incentive structures with, the SDGs in some cases, with climate goals in some cases. Putting a market price on a price on carbon, for example, is I think right now about 20 to 25% of all the carbon emissions in the world are under some kind of cap and trade or carbon tax pricing scheme. And that will only increase in the coming years and hopefully align incentives more. So the market, the invisible hand of the market, can do the work on do some of the work on aligning the incentives on carbon. But I think and I'll be brief because we have a lot to cover, and when we get to all the 60 or so questions I'm seeing in the chat. I think the WBA will have a great role in shining a light on financial, the largest financial firms, the 400 most important financial firms in the world, and helping align those incentives because they're allocating the capital that will get to some of the solutions to the problems we're talking about.
Thank you, Matt. And now I would like to introduce Bernadette Victorio, who goes by Bea, who's the regional program lead for the Fair Finance Asia. Bea, thanks.
Hi, thanks, Delilah. And good evening, good morning from wherever you're joining us during this webinar. My name is Bernadette Victoria. I lead the Fair Finance Asia program, which is an Oxfam initiative and a network of Asian civil society organizations committed to ensuring that financial institutions' funding decisions in the region respect and uphold the social and environmental rights and well-being of local communities. FFA is a part of Fair Finance International, which is the main gatekeeper of the Fair Finance International methodology, which is also a global benchmarking tool used by civil society coalitions across 14 countries around the world, including 6 from Asia, to assess the quality of the lending and investment policies of financial institutions against key thematic areas such as climate change, human rights, gender equality, transparency, and accountability. The Fair Finance Guide methodology was essentially designed to stimulate a race to the top by financial institutions, which we as Fair Finance Network consider critical levers for change in creating long-term sustainability at the country, regional, and global levels. As a network and as Oxfam, we provided substantial comments to the WBA financial systems benchmark to ensure alignment and complementarity. And we are certainly very glad to see that this is now being launched. So our big congratulations to the team that drove this whole initiative, this whole process throughout. And we certainly see important synergies and collaborations for both our networks in many areas, such as highlighting the need for financial institutions to take more serious steps to align their policies with international norms and standards and ESG criteria for long-term positive impacts, rather than just doing no harm, and essentially moving the focus from risk assessment to greater impact creation. We also see this new financial system benchmark as a way to create greater urgency and impetus for transparency and accountability in the global, regional, and national financial sectors, which can be facilitated by financial regulators who are, of course, also important audiences for this benchmark. More importantly, we see an important collaboration for WBA and the Fair Finance Network among our allies to use our tools, our benchmarks, as basis for deeper engagement and probing into actual on-ground practices by the financial sector and comparing the discrepancy between policies and practices. This is very important for developed countries within the Fair Finance Network, already seeing great risks due to financial institutions eventually learning how to score well in benchmarks such as the Fair Finance Guide methodology, and therefore potentially using the tool for greenwashing purposes. But this is even more important for developing countries wherein the impact of non-ESG compliance and weak policies by the financial sector are translated into lived daily experiences of inequality, labor and human rights violations, and environmental degradation for some of the most vulnerable populations in the world. So last month, we at Fair Finance Asia launched our regional study on just transition, which looked at the region's overall prospects for coal phase-outs and what that would mean for the region. It is very clear that the financial sector has an important role to play in this transition to ensure that no one is left behind. And there are very urgent steps that can be taken to ensure that those bound to lose out in this energy transition, for example, are appropriately considered moving forward so that we are not merely creating new stresses and imbalances in the global energy landscape. And this is only in the energy sector. So of course, we can use the benchmarks for so many other sectors and for so many other thematic areas. So moving ahead, it will be very interesting to see how we at Fair Finance Asia can continue to collaborate with WBA in using our complementary benchmarking tools as a way to stimulate real policy and practice changes in the financial sector that can translate into real impact for people and planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Bea. So we had a few questions that we had prepared, but there are a lot of great questions coming in through the chat. So I think that we'll jump right to those to make sure that this is an engaging experience and that all of you have your inquiries addressed to the extent that we can do that. So far, I feel optimistic about it based on what's in the chat now. There was a question that there were a couple of questions that had to do with the methodology's theory of change that I think are important to just address up front, and then we can go to some of the other questions. Hamish Stewart asked about the theory of change, and Angus Bauer also asked about whether the effectiveness of policies and remedies are going to be addressed, which, as the panelists know from my comments on the prep call, is one of my favorite questions. So hopefully my personal bias didn't come in and squeezing that question in first as well. But Ellie, do you want to comment on that? And then if any of the other panelists want to say a few words about the theory of change and whether the effectiveness of the actual policies and remedies that are reported on through the methodology will be assessed somehow, that would be great.
Yes, thank you, Delilah. So the theory of change of WBA is built on the pillar of engagement. So we are creating the benchmarks to incentivize the private sector, but this comes within a wider scope and a wider target to build a movement. So through engaging with the companies that we benchmark themselves, which are the 2000 Keystone companies, and at the same time by engaging with organizations through our alliance, and by engaging also with investor groups and other interest groups that can help drive change on specific issues. We are we have a kind of three-pronged or four-pronged approach to building that movement and creating change from various angles. As part of our theory of change, we also engage actively with policymakers and regulators because we feel that regulation can often have a very fast and more immediate effect. But at the same time, we are conscious that sometimes regulations just sort of raise the floor or focus on the lowest common denominator. So, so our theory of change has sort of many arms, if that makes sense. And our benchmarks sit at the core of that. The second question was about whether we will assess certain policies or not. So the way the methodology has been built, it includes elements that are about disclosure. So whether certain pieces of information are disclosed in the methodology. This could be, for example, our indicators on the financed emissions. We look first and foremost to understand how much financing is going to harmful activities and how much is going to activities that are regenerative. But also through certain other indicators, we have included the sort of quality of the policy in various elements. So for example, on the gender equality indicator, a commitment to support women's empowerment would include having a policy to close the gender pay gaps and asking about the gender pay gaps and having a gender balance board in senior leadership teams. So in this respect, we, through our different elements, we assess the policy. This is also the case in our policy engagement indicators. So where we ask about financial institutions being responsible stewards of assets, we will also evaluate the quality of the policy that they have. Are there clear escalation points? Does the engagement policy include a number of activities, or do they focus on a specific segment? So it is a combination, as we tried to marry the ambition of where we think the financial system should be and should go, while at the same time realizing and acknowledging that in certain areas, the financial industry itself is trying to understand the metrics that need to be used, like, for example, in biodiversity.
Thanks, Ellie. And one of the thoughts that came to mind as a call to action for participants here is there's not a lot of guidance on what good looks like for these financial institutions. And so to the extent that folks can get involved with field building and using the benchmark and the iterative process to see how different organizations are performing and what best practice seems to look like, and how we can use the benchmark to develop ideas of what is practical, but really drives us forward. I think that will be very useful. There was another question about where do we expect to see leadership on the benchmark, and I think that there are a lot of questions around the challenges of implementation as well. And so we had discussed having a question around the challenges of implementation, particularly for UMAT. Perhaps, Satoshi, that might also be relevant for you and your constituency. Do any of the panelists, I guess Matt, will start with you, and then see if anybody else wants to jump in on where do we expect to see leadership? What can some of the challenges be that we're expecting? How do we expect to overcome those hurdles?
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately leadership needs to come from multiple places. Jumping back a little bit, I mean, all of us here on this panel, and a lot of people listening and watching are in the ESG sustainability world, and think about what a cultural change that has been for finance. And cultural change are super tankers on the ocean, to use a tortured metaphor. They take a long time to turn, and they're slow turning and slow moving. And so that cultural change we expect to continue, and this is part of that. We as the financial world need to show leadership, issuers do as well, and policymakers do as well, to get those incentives I talked about in the right place. And a lot of that comes down to engagement. And I've seen a lot of great, and I've been in the ESG world long enough to see engagement improved by leaps and bounds between investors and issuers and policymakers. As bad as you think it may be, 20 years ago, investors never talked to the board about anything really, and there weren't people internally at companies focused on ESG and governance, and now there's a lot more of them. ESG and engagement teams are being built and expanded at places like BlackRock and Vanguard and the large institutional investors around the world. But I think it's incumbent on each group to show leadership and not just expect someone else is going to take the reins. I think in finance there's so much we can do, but we realize that the heavy lifting on these issues to get those incentives where they need to be is likely going to come from policy in most places. And so that gets to engaging with those policymakers, making sure investors have a seat at those tables to make sure that we can allocate capital, things like a carbon market, things like better information on biodiversity, materiality, biodiversity, and climate issues. So the question is a great question, but unfortunately, it's not an easy answer. It's going to take leadership from all fronts.
Thanks, Matt. And Satoshi, I think that Matt set up his response as a perfect segue to some comments that you might want to make being involved with regulation and policy. Any perspective?
Right. Well, first of all, as in my earlier remarks, that there necessarily going to be a certain, innovators who moves ahead, and certain early adopters, early majority, and late majority and laggards. That's in some sense inevitable. And I foresee, even as a regulator, that could happen. But I believe that as the Japanese government has committed to the sustainable development goals, and that commitment comes down to the every ministry or agency within the government, and that also influenced the private sector in the end, and the financial services NZC plays a role with that overall picture. And so we hope that some financial institutions in Japan lead the way of promoting sustainability in Japan and globally. And by benchmarking their activities with relative laggards and the late majority, perhaps, we can move the average level of activities and engagement by those financial institutions. So what the Japan FSA did with the World Benchmarking Alliance, we co-hosted a series of roundtable with the covered financial institution in Japan, and what is the methodology, how they are going to be assessed by the methodology. And so they understood that what are going to happen with respect to their assessment by that methodology. And I hope that out of that process, some financial institutions will decide to be certain innovators or leaders in responding to that kind of the assessment request. And in the end, leading up to the tangible change in the society and the financial system. So, well, leadership comes from every corner, but well, benchmarking activities, I believe that that will move the overall level of the progress forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Satoshi. I know that there is increasingly a debate about the effectiveness of voluntary frameworks versus policy and regulation. And it seems like the World Benchmarking Alliance's theory of change embraces both. Corinne, do you see, what are your perspectives having been involved with sort of the standard setting and disclosure space for a while on that? Anything you want to share? And Bea, after Corinne, somebody else asked a question about the potential to have a people's ranking, I believe, if I understood correctly, of investors and financial institutions. And so curious, particularly as a civil society organization, about how civil society plays into all of this as well. So maybe we'll start with Corinne and then go to Bea.
Delilah, I think you're correct, and it's the right way to look at things, to consider both voluntary frameworks and regulatory development. Indeed, yeah, I think what you'll find is that a lot of the breaking new ground and understanding topics and integrating new things often does happen and will happen outside a regulatory space. And so that needs to continue to happen. I think what's very important, though, is that as this topic continues to gain weight and importance, that we do manage to create a dialogue between all the different, I guess, actions, streamed theories of change, so that regulatory processes and policy processes can also be well informed. I think there's been a lot of talk about fragmentation on the market, a lot of the black boxes on methodologies and so on, and it has become a very busy landscape, which is the whole reason why the WBA and UNIPEFI and 15 other organizations have become part of the impact management platform, is precisely to have a space in which some of the leading voluntary initiatives and standard setters can speak and look at areas of convergence and also better inform some of the policy and regulatory developments.
Thanks, Corinne. And Bea, I'm not sure if you had a chance to see the sources that Hamish put in the chat, but this idea of sort of public civil society being able to rank financial institutions sounds intriguing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Delilah. Interestingly, the Fair Finance Guide methodology, which is what we use in our network, is originally already a tool used by civil society to mobilize consumer awareness and action for how their money, their savings, their pensions, their insurance are using their money, to be invested in sectors or projects that are either in alignment with their values or not, and giving them a platform for them to be able to speak out on that. And very much the coalitions that are using this methodology, our coalitions in Europe, are still very much using this this approach to mobilize consumer awareness and to mobilize consumer voice, to really call on the financial sector for those changes. But obviously, that is something that is more difficult to translate in a developing country context, where we have problems with financial inclusion, and there's not a lot of consumer education and awareness for how the people in consumers are more, they're not very aware of how they could impact that change using their own financial their voices to impact their bank's activities. So absolutely, within our network, of course, we have this diversified approach, but that is already existing. That is how our methodology is also working. And that's why there is already that's taken into account. And from the developing country perspective, of course, our civil society partners working closely with those consumers, with those vulnerable communities and populations, highlighting, the impacts that they are experiencing as a result of these projects, of these companies that are being financed by those banks. The role of our partners in civil society is exactly to, shed light on those practices and to ensure that financial regulators and the financial institutions themselves in those countries, operating in those countries, are aware of these practices and making changes, meaningful changes in their policies and practices on the ground.
Thanks, Bea. I think that the diversity of types of stakeholders that we have on this panel is representative of the World Benchmarking Alliance's efforts to really reach out to different stakeholders, civil society, organizations, voluntary disclosure frameworks, and policymakers and regulators can all hold investors accountable. And so this seems like a very useful tool for change for all of these different stakeholders, as well as for the investors to improve themselves and learn about their own improvement and where they are with things. There were a few technical questions in the chat. I think, probably top of mind, particularly for the financial institutions in terms of the ability to implement and making sense of all the different frameworks out there, is Matt Ripley's question on how does the World Benchmarking Alliance framework link to the architecture of Tcfd and Sfdr? We also have another question. I think the human rights question was answered in the chat, so I'm going to skip over that one, but somebody please correct me and I'll double check. There's also another question from Kudakwashe Magwedere, which is, what's the definition of nature and biodiversity? So maybe there's levering what the task force on nature disclosures is working on. Maybe that's brought into this. And there was a follow-on question about the health and safety just being relevant to humans or also animals that ties into biodiversity. So how are we thinking about using the tools that have been developed by these other frameworks to integrate into the World Benchmarking Alliance framework? Maybe should we start? I'm Ellie or Karine. I don't know if either of you want to start because you've both been working with so many other frameworks and thinking about this.
I can briefly say about sort of nature and biodiversity. So this is a very good question about whether we're focusing on animals or humans. So at the moment I suppose we are looking at this in a more high level. In terms of the definition, we are, one second, because my notes are failing me. But as with everything at WBA, we are anchoring our analysis and our insights on the best available science. So in this case, it is the international sort of recognized frameworks on biodiversity and this kind of the Convention on Biological Diversity and these sort of definitions that we are using. In terms, we're not going to go into a sort of detail on the specific policies of the financial institutions with regards to humans or animals. We will keep it as a more sort of high level view of whether they are incorporating these considerations in their business models and acknowledging the impact that they have on biodiversity loss through the various financial activities. the second question was about Tcfd and Sfdr. So Tcfd, we are sort of following closely the developments, and also for TNFD, and of course the emergent Tcfd that you are involved in, Delilah. But I think although we in our indicators, we are following a similar approach, which is about setting targets and tracking against those targets. The key differentiator with Tcfd is that we look for an impact management perspective rather than a risk assessment perspective. So in this respect, we are more aligned with Sfdr and the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance and the double materiality approach and principle that they have adopted. We are following very closely the developments there so that we can align and are already aligning. But we do want the benchmark to be globally applicable, which is why we are not sort of calling it double materiality, but rather we are sort of looking for that approach of impact management. As part of our research, we will of course capture reporting according to Tcfd, which is a very important, let's say, first step, or a very important behavior anyway. But in order to fulfill the ambition, we feel that a greater shift in culture and in sort of corporate thinking is necessary, which is all about acknowledging the impact and not only thinking about how climate change and biodiversity loss and rising inequality is a risk to the financial institution.
Thanks, Ali. I believe that there was a question in the chat about whether there could be more granularity on the assessment. I'm not sure if that actually got answered in the chat. It seems like a quick one that we could address in the last minute of this Q&A session. And there's another question that just came in, considering the fact that the methodology will apply to different types of financial institutions. How does it take into account the different types of activities? I know that was a factor in the consultations that we were all engaged in. Should we take that quickly, Ali?
Yeah. So indeed, we have tried to focus the methodology on elements and issues that are applicable across the different business activities. So across asset owners, asset managers, banks, insurers. Within asset owners, we have pension funds, but also sovereign wealth funds and development financial institutions. So we are looking, that's why we have also so many sort of key indicators in governance and strategy, and they account for so much, 40%. Because we feel that we need to change that thinking. So, however, we do acknowledge that these are very different activities, and we have taken sort of 2 steps in order to be able to make the assessment meaningful. One is that we will publish the results in a visually engaging way so that banks can compare themselves to banks and asset managers to asset managers, because we also realize that this is usually what drives behavior and engagement with companies, financial institutions being no exception. And then the second aspect is that we also know that we are dealing with very different beasts here, and that we have these mega institutions that have activities that spread across different areas. So in these respects, we will try to look for consistency of approach by the financial institution across the different segments. We evaluate and assess the group and not the different subsidiaries of the financial institutions, as we look for that coherence across their business activities horizontally and vertically. And if I may add, as I saw someone was asking about the way the different issues are weighted within the measurement areas. And this is included in the methodology, but it is also useful to mention here. So all the issues are weighted equally within the measurement area, with a few exceptions. So the first two indicators, which are about impact management and senior leadership accountability, are double weighted within the measurement area, which constitutes 40%. All indicators are equally weighted across the second measurement area, which accounts for 30%. And within the third measurement area, most of the indicators account for around 20%, but in total, within that 30%, and extra marks are assigned for financial institutions in the areas of the human rights due diligence, where we ask them to include this process across all their financing activities. So it is complicated. It sounds complicated, mirroring the financial institutions that we have to evaluate. But in the publication, the scoring guidelines and the evaluation that has taken place will all be available and clear for people to see and understand.
Great, thanks, Ellie. Well, we are starting to near the end of the program, so I would love to invite each of our speakers to share just a really brief 1 or 2 lines on what comes to mind in terms of next steps in implementation or reactions to what was discussed today. So why don't we start with Bea? Bea, do you have any final thoughts? A couple of sentences, really brief.
Sure. Thanks, Delilah. I think from our perspective, really, we welcome, of course, the launch of this financial systems benchmark. And from our perspective, you know, we are really we really fully understand that this is a systems feedback loop for WBA, that it will continue to improve. But we urge also WBA to use this benchmark as a way to link with its other systems benchmark, you know, to ensure that the companies being assessed, you know, in the other benchmarks that are being financed by the institutions being assessed in this benchmark, you know, are also, you know, linked. And we see that there is, you know, engagement based on the relationship of those companies and financial institutions. And, you know, to work together with civil society organizations such as our network to ensure that really we can catch those discrepancies between policies and practices, so that it doesn't stop at the benchmarking of policies on paper, but also we see the impact on the ground.
Thanks, Bea. Satoshi, any final thoughts?
Well, certainly for the benefit of our regulation or supervision, it is very important to compare the financial institutions across sectors in the financial sector or across countries. And that kind of benchmarking in the global level and of the holistic issues of sustainability, we certainly enhance our assessment of the sustainability in the financial system. And that guides us move ahead with the sustainability agenda or sustainable development goals. So I really look forward to the actual scores and the rankings in a 1 year time. And I really also look forward to using that numbers for our activities in assessing the financial institutions in Japan. Thank you.
Thanks, Satoshi. Karine.
Thank you. No, well, yeah, the end and the beginning, in a way, of a long journey, and so this is, you know, this is an important moment. I think to the point that was made by Bernadette, to make sure there's, you know, real action on the ground. I think one thing that would be interesting for WBA to consider as it continues to iterate the benchmark is how much we can begin more into the actual substance of what is good. At the moment, of course, it's inherent also with a benchmark. There's a lot of reliance on disclosure of, it is said that there is commitment, there's a statement of commitment, which is different to then, actually what is being done, and disclosing what a process is there is one thing. Then actually giving a sense of what would a good process look like is fundamental as well. And so I think that's where connections really are important with other frameworks and initiatives who can provide those some of those answers, whether it's through things like the principles for responsible banking or the principles of positive impact finance. I think that's very important. Another aspect, and that echoes, I think, some of the questions we heard, is the contextualization. At the end of the day, there really is, an importance of thinking about what makes sense in different geographic realities. There's obviously a very strong push right now on the two environmental and social dimensions, but the environmental is very specific on certain biodiversity and climate issues. But depending on the part of the world, I think maybe the entry point for those topics would need to be differentiated, and so that's perhaps nuance that could be built on in the future. And that again goes back to this question of what does a process look like, and a good process does that kind of contextualization. So those are some thoughts for the future. Thank you so much for today.
Thanks, Corinne. Matt, and then maybe we'll hand it over to Ellie right after Matt for closing remarks.
Sure, I'll just quickly say, again, I think the work of the WBA is very important. It helps us all to align incentives in the financial world as we need to, as Satoshi was talking about, to tackle the issue of sustainability in finance. And to all those people out there listening and watching, I know that there is ESG acronym fatigue that is real, and WBA is a new one to a lot of you. But I think it's a worthwhile. I think this is an exciting time in the ESG world. I've been doing this for 20-25 years, and it's a symptom that there are so many annoying acronyms out there that a lot of things are happening. Not that WBA is annoying. There's just so many, but it behooves us all to do our homework and to roll up our sleeves as analysts and do the work and understand what's behind each of these initiatives. So I look forward to working with the WBA in the future.
Thanks, Matt. And I'll use your comment there as an excuse for accidentally messing up Tcfd's name when I was referring to them before.
I do. I jumble my acronyms all the time. Don't worry.
Yeah, too many to keep track of,
Yeah.
but an important one nonetheless. Ellie, do you want to wrap up with closing remarks? The next steps?
Sure. Just wanted to thank everyone in the panel. Thank you very much for being here. We have held conversations with each and every one of you, and really looking forward to continuing our collaboration and relationships. To all of you that are listening, please reach out to us. Our email is on the website. We can also put it here. It's info.financial@benchmarkingalliance.org. So please reach out and tell us what you think of the methodology, especially if you're part of the FSC 400 institutions. We look forward to engaging with you. And again, a very big thank you to all of you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Enjoy your day. Looking
Thank
forward
you.
to using the benchmark.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.